Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm here with Taylor Pearson. Hi Taylor.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh no, welcome to the show. Just a little bit of an introduction. Taylor is the best-selling author of The End of Jobs: Money, Meaning and Freedom Without the 9 to 5, and he is a systems-obsessed entrepreneur, which is very cool. So, first of all, tell us just a bit about you and your journey into entrepreneurship up to this point.
So, I was a history major in college, and I was basically a history major because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I like to read and I like to write and kind of study people. And history is a very broad subject, so you can kind of get away with doing whatever you wanted. And at least in the US, the sort of default path for studying history is law school. I think there was like 25 people in my cohort of history majors, and like 17 of them were going to law school. And so that was very much, I kind of thought maybe I'll go get a PhD, but that's a 10-year track, and not great job prospects on the other end of it in most cases for kind of humanities. So I said, well, I'll go to law school, and then on a kind of a fling, ended up going to a study abroad program in Argentina, and had this sort of cliche travel experience of, oh my God, look at this different culture and all these different people, and I see the world from a new perspective, and everything else you've ever heard from that kind of, that story, that experience, and like really broaden my perspective to what I wanted to do. And about the same time, I read The 4 Hour Work Week, which was a seminal book for me, and I think for a lot of other people. It kind of opened my eyes to this new world, and that set me off on a different path. I was an interpreter for a little while in hospitals. I worked as an English teacher in Brazil. I worked at a marketing agency, and then eventually found my way to this kind of apprenticeship position with a small entrepreneurial company based out of San Diego. And they had a line of e-commerce manufacturing companies, and I did the online marketing for them for about 2 years. And so that was kind of like my gateway moment into entrepreneurship. I worked in this small company. I got to hang out with the CEOs on a regular basis, learn how they ran the company, kind of learn how this entrepreneurship stuff worked. And then I finished working with them a couple of years ago and sat down and started writing The End of Jobs, which came out about 3 months ago now.
And so, well, what led you into, what specifically made you go, I want to write a book about this?
I think I was always attracted to writing in general, and I was actually sitting at a conference I'm about to fly back to a year later, later this week, in Bangkok with the guys I used to work for. They run a company or a online forum called the Dynamite Circle, which is kind of this online forum for location independent entrepreneurs. So I was at that conference last year, and we were sitting around, and I was talking with someone, like, how is this possible? We're in Bangkok, Thailand. There's 300 entrepreneurs here. They're in Bangkok, Thailand for a week. They're running their businesses from their laptops. We were reflecting on friends we had in New York and where we grew up. How is, how do you explain this? Like, how are, these two groups of people, like, they're both intelligent, they're both hardworking, but they're getting very, very different outcomes in terms of what their lifestyles look like and their incomes and their professional lives. And that was kind of the genesis of the book. Like, how do we explain this?
So tell us a bit more, because the title's very good. It's quite alarmist in a way, which actually the book isn't, in my opinion. But tell us, what is the end of jobs? What do you mean by that?
So yeah, it's an optimistic book with a very pessimistic title. Um, so what I mean by the end of jobs is that we have this certain notion of work and certain notion of jobs. I think that's kind of been formed over the 20th century. This kind of like gold watch notion that you go to a large, typically firm or corporation. You spend a long time working there. You spend most of your working life doing, a relatively similar thing to what you started out with. You get your degree in accounting, and you finish school in your 20s, and then you spend the next 40 to 45 years doing accounting, and then you retire with your pension. And that notion of uh, kind of continuous careers, those jobs, is disappearing. that work now is much more entrepreneurial, that even people working in companies are going to change roles. Every 3 to 5 years, they're going to have to constantly be reinventing themselves and their careers. So there's this notion of like work is changing. It's becoming less, as we think about quote unquote jobs, and more entrepreneurial. And then also that like they're just more and more entrepreneurs, that the natural size of the firm as transaction costs go down is getting smaller and smaller, right? You don't have to have large corporations to get things done. You can have kind of these like armies of freelancers and entrepreneurs that can self-organize for a project. Sort of like Hollywood puts together a movie, like everyone's sitting around in LA and everyone comes together and makes this amazing, production and then kind of disperses. And that's more and more true of the economy at large.
I was just listening to Unemployable podcast with Brian Clark. Have you listened to that podcast?
I have.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the term unemployable. And I think because, and I said it to my mum once, I'm like, Mum, I'm unemployable now. And she's like, no, she hated me to use that word. But what I meant was I can't work in a hierarchical organization. And I think what you're saying is jobs in the way that they have been is different to work. Because we all need to work, right? It gives our life meaning. What you're not saying it's the end of work. You're saying it's the end of the traditional model.
Yes, very much. And it's tricky to talk about these kind of things. I thought there's a lot of new words, I think, that need to be invented, or at least like words need to be redefined that, when we look at, you look at traditional measures of economic productivity, and people look at job reports, that's a measure of how healthy is the economy. And that made sense. That was a very logical thing to look at for the 20th century. And it's probably less and less, job reports is a less and less intelligent way to look at the economy. That, a lot of people I know personally are much more productive now that they don't have jobs. They create a lot more value in the economy now that they are unemployed.
Yeah, or unemployable.
Or unemployable.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and that is interesting. And have attitudes to work as well changed? And again, I mentioned my mum because she's in her 60s. She's 68, so very much of that kind of baby boomer generation. And she had not the same job, but she worked in the same company, Hewlett Packard, a good American company, for 30 years. Got a good pension, all of that. And she doesn't know what I do all day, And she says, she didn't have a choice about enjoying work. How can I say these things? Now you're 26, I think you said, and I'm 40, but I feel more like a millennial, I think, in my attitudes. Has that attitude to work fundamentally changed? Do we just want more than security?
I think so. And I think we want more because it's available. And I think because it's actually more in demand. So if you look at, I think one book that influenced my thinking a lot on this was Drive by Daniel Pink. And there's actually a great little 8-minute YouTube video, I think, where someone sketches it out. But he cites a few studies, and there's a couple other books I reference, that if you look at the kind of work that's in demand by the economy now, so work is becoming more entrepreneurial, and there was a study that came out, I think it was KPCNB, and they were talking about, if you look at job growth or job decline over the last 20 years, that all segments of jobs are declining except for non-routine cognitive jobs. So basically, you're doing something with your mind and you're doing something new over and over. So these are basically entrepreneurial jobs, right? You're reinventing your position over and over and over. And that the kind of motivation for that work is actually much different than traditional work. That the model we have of jobs and how motivation works is this carrot and stick model, right? You're doing this unfavorable task, and so you get a bigger carrot held out in front of you, and that lets you do the task. And for kind of industrial work, you think about putting together pieces on a factory line, that's true. That is an effective motivator. But for this kind of creative work, it's much more important in terms of the actual value of the work, that the person be in a situation where they find meaning, whatever they decide the meaning is in the work, and they have the sense of freedom and autonomy to do the work they want. And there's a great study by Dan Ariely in India where he basically took 3 cohorts of people to do some kind of creative cognitive task, and that there was an inverse correlation between monetary reward and performance on the task. That the group that was paid the least but kind of did it for the pleasure of it was actually more effective at it than the group that was paid the most.
And I think we can see that, the audience listening are authors writing books, and you can actually see it in some of these top best-selling authors who are forced to write the same books over and over again. I mean, who you just don't want to read anymore because they're repeating the same crap. And compare that to somebody who's writing, their first novel or their first nonfiction book and is really driven by it. There may not be any money at the end, but they're driven by the passion of the topic, as you were, and as I am. It's the drive to create, as you say. And interesting, you mentioned Daniel Pink. I just wrote down. I read his book, A Whole New Mind. I think it was 10 years ago now. And
yeah, he's been writing for a while.
Yeah, and he predicted this rise of the creative job being the thing that you can't outsource. We can outsource pretty much a lot of things that can be done either by robots or for people who are cheaper than us, but we can never outsource creativity, right? And we should put the spin on things now. What do you mean by entrepreneurship, and what can people consider as the options for an entrepreneurial portfolio income as such?
So I guess to answer the first question, the way I define it in the book is creating and connecting. So this idea, I think non-routine cognitive work is actually a pretty good description of what entrepreneurial work is. So you're using your mind in some way, and you're doing something novel on a repeated basis, right? It's like you have to come up with something new and new. And actually, I wrote down, you sent this question over, and there was a really good from a professor, actually. And let's see. She said, being entrepreneurial is essentially about thinking and doing something that we have not done before in order to achieve a desirable goal or outcome. It is about assessing a situation, designing alternatives, and choosing a new way, or perhaps a combination of ways that we hope will lead us to something better, however we happen to define better at the moment. I thought that was quite articulate. That was better than my definition.
But the fact that it's something you've not done before, I think, freaks people out, right? They think, but you have to be an expert. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I think it definitely still freaks me out. Like, I think I had lots of moments writing the book where I was like, who am I to write this book? I don't know why we do that. I certainly have the same problem. You attach a certain stigma to credentials, and I remember my family are all in healthcare. My sister's a physician, and she has MD after her name, and that we attach a really high level of importance to it. And even I catch myself doing it as well. So I'm not sure why it is we do that. It certainly doesn't seem to be true. There seems to be a very loose correlation, if any correlation at all, between having some sort of credentials and being competent. Those seem to be largely independent variables in a lot of domains, especially entrepreneurial areas.
And the importance of being able to learn is actually, that's the more important thing. Going, okay, so I need to learn this, and then learning it. That's more important, isn't it, in an entrepreneurial life?
Yeah, I just finished reading Sapiens.
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting.
Really interesting. But one of the things he said in that book that stood out to me, and I was thinking on it, was basically, he kind of credited the success of Europe in the last 500 years to basically that typically when countries went into, or people invaded, they assumed they already had all the answers, and they would tell the people they were invading how to do everything. And that the Europeans basically took this notion of maybe we could learn something from everyone else. And so they went and took the best from everyone else in the world. And that was kind of I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way to think about it. That's kind of true on this micro perspective as well. If you have this attitude of, I don't know everything, but I can go out and find the people that do know everything and, repackage that or redo that in some sort of interesting way, you can create a lot of value.
And just in terms of the, entrepreneurial, possibilities, you said you're in this mastermind group, you wrote the book because of all these people, doing, entrepreneurial things. Just give us a couple of examples of, how are people making a living in this way?
So I think the kind of the more interesting examples are the ones that people have latched onto from the book. There's a guy named Rob Walling who actually spoke at the event when I was there. And his story, I think, is interesting because he's gone through so many iterations. So he was working in a large corporation and left to do software development consulting, and then started out with like these very, very small products. So this is kind of one thing I talk about in this book, this idea of stair stepping, that you can start in very small markets, in very non-competitive markets, where even though you're not the best expert in the world, there's very little competition and you can still do quite well. So he was selling books about like, I think his first book was about duck blinds, which is like a way you hunt
Oh, yeah.
ducks. So he was like making $500 a month selling this like ebook for $27. This was maybe 10 years ago now, when you could still sell $27 ebooks about duck blinds. And then he bought a job board for electricians in his local area. And he was doing a job board for electricians in his local area. So now he had a couple income streams, and he started going into, I think he had a website building service for people that wanted to have wedding websites. So you're going to have your wedding website set up. So now he's doing 2 or 3 different things in fairly small, non-competitive markets, right? So there's not a lot of electrician job boards based in his city in California. And then he started stair-stepping this up into bigger and bigger businesses. So eventually he bought a business that was doing invoicing software for like a very specific industry. So it's .NET Invoice, and then a long tail SEO software. And now he's working on kind of a larger email marketing software. So starting at duck blind ebooks, and then he's kind of moved up into bigger and bigger businesses.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think and that's a really good point. And one of the things I go on and on about is these multiple streams of income. And authors in particular, we can't make a living from one book. You know this. You have one book, right, at the moment?
Yeah. It was great for the first month. It was maybe viable. And then after that, not so much.
It's not so much. So as someone who has a non-fiction book, how are you leveraging the book into multiple streams of income?
I'm still very much trying to figure that out, to be honest. I've done some like free speaking stuff, and I'm looking to get into more speaking. I think that would be interesting and something I really enjoy doing. But beyond that, I don't have, I have like other consulting projects that aren't really related to the book at this point. So I'm very much still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, which is a great answer. And actually, a lot of people do that, write the book and then figure it out later. But I did notice from your website is, like you said, you're doing some consulting, and you're obviously very busy because you're not taking any new clients right now.
Yeah.
So that's great. And it's a great way to start. And then, as you say, you get into more scalable things. So I wanted to ask you about the mindset side, because I know that a lot of people just are very worried about this potential shift. I mean, this shift is coming. I believe it. I've made the shift. What can people do to change their mindset around risk, around, being scared and fear of change, I guess?
A lot of people have asked me this since the book came out, and I've been like trying to come up with like talking to other people that have gone through it, like what were the things that impacted them. And the big things that seem to come up over and over are content and community, which are, kind of like creating this steady diet of information that is around this new worldview. So like, this is what I love about blogs and podcasts and all this kind of stuff that you can, even if in your local area, you're going to find very few people that are kind of taking these new entrepreneurial routes, that you can read blogs and listen to podcasts, and kind of get this like steady stream of like, look at all these people that are succeeding at this, and look at all these different routes to how they're doing it. Like, which one of these would fit for me? Which one of these can I emulate? And then I think the other thing is community, which is, how can you find other people, surround yourself with other people that are thinking in similar ways, trying to do similar things, which I think is a real challenge. Like most people's day-to-day lives, you don't walk around and find people saying things like jobs are ending. Yeah. That's a very atypical point of view in the mainstream. So I think if you can get yourself into some sort of online community, or like a personal mastermind group where you have 4 or 5 other people that you're working towards similar goals, And I think in person is still the best. If you can find people in your local area that are, trying to write and become full-time authors, like can you have dinner every Saturday with those people, or have a mastermind group? I think that's still really the most powerful way.
Absolutely. And what about that fear of risk? What is more risky, a job or the kind of multiple streams of income approach?
I mean, I would certainly say the job is more risky, certainly over the long term. I think um, initially the entrepreneurial path appears much more risky because the cash flow is just so, unsteady up and down, as opposed to like the paycheck that comes in every Friday, every 2 weeks. Um, I think that the biggest thing I notice, in myself and talking to other people is just having to remind yourself of this difference between what feels risky and what actually is risky when you sit down and look at it kind of intellectually or really think through it. So I think even entrepreneurs, most entrepreneurs I talk to, I think feel like they're doing their emotional sensations they still feel very risky on a day-to-day basis, even if the data doesn't reflect that. Even if the data looks like, what they're doing is less and less safe. I think we're, the programming from evolution of, you're walking through the savannah and you hear a rustle in the bushes, even if it's food, 99 times out of 100, the one time it's a lion, it kills you. And so we're trained to walk away from kind of that unknown. And that's not true in most cases in the modern world, right? Like if you start a side project, there's not really a lot of risk there.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. And most people listening will be writing as a side project, as I did. I spent 3.5 years while still working my day job, building this business, and then only then did I leave.
Yeah.
But it's funny talking about fear in the last, I haven't really admitted this, so I'll admit it to you. Why not? We've never met. To the listeners, I hired my husband out of his day job a month or so ago now. And that was a big fearful moment, because it suddenly was, we always did have that steady job as his steady job as a backup, even though I'm very independent. And then it was, okay, this is the end. This is the end of the job as such.
Yeah.
And we've gone through like 2 months of me just being, oh my goodness, this is a big risk. And now it's so funny. It's worked out better than I could have ever expected. It's like, it's just been amazing. So I think that fear is inevitable at any point in your journey. And I dare say there'll be much more scary moments to come. But facing that, I mean, what's the worst that could happen? He has to go back to his job.
Yeah. I think it is always good to like play out the worst case scenario. And like that typically does seem to be the worst case scenario. Like the worst case scenario is I'm doing exactly what I'm doing right now.
Yeah. And I think people worry that they won't be able to go back into their job. But the reality is, whatever the scaremongering of the press, there's always work that you can get. Like I've said, well, I'll just go and do cleaning. I'll get on TaskRabbit and I'll be a cleaner. At the end of the day, you can still do that, right? That might be the worst case, or stack shelves that, until the robots do it.
But yeah, I don't know if the fear ever goes away entirely. I was talking with someone who, I know his business is growing very, very fast. It's already very, very large, like multiple 7-figure business. And he was like, yeah, 2 to 3 times a week, I think it's all going to collapse and disappear and it's all over. And I was like, okay, good. Not just me.
Yeah. And it's like with writing, the fear of judgment, the fear of failure, we have to go through all of these things. And I mean, have you had a backlash to the title at all?
Not anything substantial. Yeah, I've had a few negative reviews on Amazon, as everyone ever has.
You've got to have those.
Yeah. But no, nothing dramatic or notable, to be honest.
And then I wanted to ask you, again, you're a lot younger than me, but, closer to the education system. For people listening who have children who are at school, or, maybe they're homeschooling them or whatever they're doing, there's kids who are at the moment in the education system, it's not really designed for this new world. It's still in this shifting period of, exams where you're not allowed to use Google, or exams when you're not allowed to collaborate, which essentially is what we do in the grown-up world now. We don't sit on our own and come up with things without a computer. It's ridiculous. So what would you say to people with kids? Like, what should they be encouraging the kids to learn?
So parents I've talked to, I think the two most kind of universal and seem to be helpful suggestions, all behind this idea of, I think traditional schooling system very much teaches this notion of like there are certain rules and you win by getting good at these rules. Whereas kind of what we're talking about in doing entrepreneurial things is a lot more about the rules are all made up and you're successful by making up new, more interesting, more profitable rules for yourself. So I guess the two specific things I've seen people do with their children that seem to be really effective are international travel, especially to some sort of developing country or not Western Europe or the US or Canada kind of thing. And there's organizations, one I've heard of or had friends do is woofing, which is I think worldwide organic farmers.
Farming something.
Yeah. You can go and basically live for free on a farm, and you like work 10 or 20 hours a week. And like lots of other programs like that where you can go do kind of extended travel in the developing country and kind of get this new perspective. So I think that seems to be really powerful. And the other thing I think that's maybe more practical and tactical is learning to code, computer programming. Which is, I think it's good for a couple reasons is, if you do want to have kind of some security, like if you're going to pick a job that's definitely not going to disappear, like computer programming is like a great choice to go, that if you're competent at that for the next 50 years, you'll almost certainly be able to make enough money to survive. And that it also, I think, is a really effective way of teaching this. You can actually create wealth almost instantly, right? You can sit down for 4 hours and with nothing, a blank screen, and you write code on this screen, and all of a sudden there's more value in the world than there was 4 hours ago. And you get this real sense of like, I made something and it's valuable and it didn't take anything other than me thinking hard.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this. And this coding thing, I think it also, what it does is it allows you to create something in the world very fast. Like it really, you can literally just do some code to print something on the screen, for example, output something in a color that whirls around. And it's like a demonstrable change affecting the world, which, writing a book is a lot of a bigger thing. But I'm totally with you on that. And it's something I've put on my list that I think I should learn at my age. I mean, and it's funny because one of my jobs before, I used to interface with the computer programmers. So I think by understanding code, even if the code is outsourced to India, for example, then if you're cognizant of the code, you can write the specs that somebody else can code, but you have to know that you can create it.
Yeah, and it was, I can't code. I can do basic HTML. I can't do anything
That's something
substantial. But it was interesting. I was actually used to do sales for a software project. And it was really interesting. I go to the developer and be like, can we do this? And he was like, we can do anything. Like anything is possible. Like it's just a question of like time and resources. Because I just talk about the opportunity cost and the trade-offs. And I was like, oh, right. Like, we can do anything. It's like, do we want to spend a month building this feature or is it better, So you kind of understand like, yes, anything is possible. Now we're just talking about opportunity cost and trade-offs and risk, which is a different way of thinking about things. In most jobs, like, can we do this? No. We can't do this.
Yeah, or it has to go through. The other thing is not having to ask permission. What's so great? My husband's been like, wow, because he used to work for Deloitte, which is a really big company, and he's like, wow, I can just say, let's do this, and then we do it, and it's done. I don't have to write a document that asks permission to do it. Or what was so funny is they even have a form for innovation. Like if you want to innovate, you have to fill in a form, and I'm like, that's just so different. To teach kids that they can just come up with an idea and then make it, That to me seems to be the best way, and not just kids, like the adults listening who are afraid. And I mean, I think I've spent the last 10 years trying to unlearn what I learned at school
Yeah.
and university. Do you still feel that at
I do. I
26?
think a lot of times I think about like my brain is like a big wire. I'm like ripping out the old wiring and like trying to put in better wiring. You know,
Yeah.
like this wiring is no good and it's got to come out and I need to
Stop
lace
following the
in.
rules.
Yeah, I need to lace in better wiring. And I think blogging in a lot of ways did that for me too. It's like I don't think it's quite. I think coding is probably better. It's a little more tangible. You can like see the effects. But I think blogging sort of did that in the sense. Yeah, you can
I
like make
totally agree with
something
you.
and put it out in the world.
And get a response. And I actually
Yeah.
think coding is just as creative as writing poetry, or in fact it is more like poetry because you have to get the exact lines and it has to be really nice, whereas writing novels is, if you wrote code like you wrote novels, it would just be a mess because it would be overblown. But I think coding is super creative, and that's going to be so important in the new world. Now, I wanted to ask you a bit about this in terms of the publishing world, and, because publishing is still so old school. And I heard another podcast, I think it was Peter Diamandis, who you've probably read his Bold and Abundance, which I absolutely love. And he basically said, once the organizations are going to the government to ask for protection, the industry is done. And that is what the publishing industry is doing in America right now, going and asking them to like shut down Amazon, which is kind of crazy. Now, tell us, what did you do with this book in terms of your publishing decisions, and what do you think is the future in the book world?
So I guess I can relate my experience. I'm just learning about the traditional publishing industry in like the last 2 months. So my experience there is very fresh. I self-published because no publisher would have taken me seriously. And actually, I had a meeting with a publisher after the book came out, and it had already done fairly well. And they, pretty much said, like, if you'd come to us 9 months ago and like showed us how many email subscribers and Twitter followers you had, like, we would have laughed at you. Like, like no agent would have taken you seriously. Like, we would have never talked to you. And so I think, it seems like self-publishing might be emerging as this like interesting route. I guess if you're going to write a proposal and you don't already have a large platform, like it might just be better to self-publish a book and sell 5,000 copies and then go to a publisher and say, hi, I wrote a book. Here's my Amazon sales numbers for 5,000 copies. Like, I'd like to write another one. Are you interested? And kind of come at it from this position of strength. So that was the way. I didn't know if I was, and I guess I still don't know if I'm going to go kind of the traditional publishing route, but it's self-publishing seems to be this kind of like new avenue into that if you want to do that. So I guess that's been interesting from my perspective.
Yeah, and for me, it's about, again, not asking permission and not having to go through all the kind of traditional hoops. I just can't be dealing with that. Let's just get on with things. But how did you, as somebody who didn't have a big platform or anything, how did you actually do the marketing for the book?
So I think the big things for me that were effective in marketing, one was I blogged the book, quote unquote. So about 30 to 50% of the book appeared in some form on my blog before I published the book, which I was like very hesitant to do. I was like, oh, like if everyone sees it already, like no one will want to read the book, and I was just totally wrong. That built up kind of a small but significant audience around the ideas in the book that was amazingly helpful when the actual book released in terms of the launch. Other things I did that I found really effective, I wrote a lot of personal emails. So I went into Gmail and I downloaded everyone I'd emailed in the past 5 years. And I basically sorted those into people that weren't really relevant to the book and obviously threw them out. And then people that I knew very well personally and had good relationships with and would be interested in the book. And then people I knew, kind of acquaintances, but that also be interested in the book. And I wrote all of them. There's like 300 something people. I had a template email saying, please leave a review on Amazon. Please share this thunderclap.it link. So for people not familiar with Thunderclap, it's this service that lets you synchronize social sharing. So at 12 p.m. on Wednesday, Eastern U.S. time the day my book came out. 118 people shared the same link. So you create this kind of surround sound effect of like who is this guy and what's this book about? Like, why did 17 people in my Facebook feed just share it at the same time? So I wrote all of them personal emails. So kind of half templated and then half, like, hey, it was great seeing you in LA last year. How's this project going? Just so you know, I'm like working on this book. It's going to be out in a month. I would love it if you would support this Thunderclap here and write a review when it comes out. So that wasn't a very, I guess, not scalable. It took a bunch of time, but was really, really effective. And people, like, you can tell it was a personal email. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't see everyone in LA last year. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, I took the time to write it, and people really appreciate that. That was really effective. I think I gave it away for free for 4 days, which I was also very hesitant about at first. And I think, just like blogging it out, the inverse was true. That giving it away for free let me do a lot of things I couldn't have done had I charged initially. And I think let me both reach more people and make more money. And so I think part of the reason that was for me is one, it let me reach out to people to support the book who wouldn't have probably supported it otherwise. So people I knew that were maybe bigger influencers, I think to ask them to recommend a paid book would have been a lot.
Difficult.
There's like personal brand equity. And they're like, well, I haven't read the whole thing and I don't know if it's good. Free. It's like, sure. Like if someone downloads it and they don't like it, like it's free, so let me reach out to a lot more people. And then it also let me ask kind of the small, at a few hundred email subscribers when the book launched, this kind of small community to do things that were more helpful in the marketing as opposed to buying the book. Instead of saying, hey, go buy my book for, $10, $15, $20, whatever. Instead, like, please leave a review, please share, please write a post on Reddit, please write a post on, like one of the Hacker News or one of these other sites where people share articles and books. And so actually made the kind of initial reach much, much broader. And then also kind of catapulted it or moved it much farther, faster up the Amazon rank. So it was, for a couple of days, it was the #1 business and money book in Amazon. And there's no way it would have gotten there had I not given it away for free for 4 days first.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that will encourage people because you only had a couple of hundred subscribers, like you said, but you really mined your personal email list, which as a blogger, you probably had emailed with people who have blogs and that type of thing. So that's really great. And then we're almost out of time, but just, you talk about being a systems type person, systems obsessed type person. What systems did you use to get the book written? Because it is very well organized and you're obviously an organized guy, but what was your system for getting that nonfiction book done and out there?
I think the biggest influence on me in terms of like structuring creative time is an essay from Paul Graham called Makers and Managers Time. And basically he talks, there's got kind of two kinds of work that most entrepreneurs do, which is one is this like maker's work of like writing or creating where you need long, 2 to 4 hours, not interrupted, whether that's like for a coder coding or a writer writing, that you need to kind of be uninterrupted. So that was how I did it. I had 2 hours pretty much every morning when I was doing the writing, where I would sit down and work on the book, and then left the rest of the day either for consulting projects I was working on or marketing for the book.
And that's what I talk about as well, like diarizing the time. And for me, it's the morning is creating and the afternoon is doing stuff like this. And it always works really well for me being in the UK, because for the US, it's mostly, I'm always doing these things in my afternoon.
Yeah, that's convenient.
Which works really well. Right. So where can people find you and your book online?
So the book is on Amazon. You can search The End of Jobs. And then you can also go to taylorpearson.me. That's my site. You can download the first 3 chapters of the book there. More info about me. And then I'm on Twitter at taylorpearsonme. And I love Twitter, so that's where I tend to hang out.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Taylor. That was great.
Thank you so much for having me.